Thanks so much, David. Welcome, everybody. It's great to have you with us visiting, and I'm really delighted to have three friends and colleagues here to talk about pandemic time, which is an issue that I have thought a lot about. I mean, I've thought generally about time, but particularly how our experience of time, our temporality has changed in the pandemic. And so if you didn't have the opportunity to watch the videos that our participants very kindly recorded, which I hope you did, they really raised a lot of interesting and intersecting issues. And so my role here is to introduce the panel very briefly to you. Their bios are also online, and to just suggest some threads that bind the different presentations and some questions that emerge from them. And then we'll have a conversation. A little conversation among ourselves for about the first 30 minutes of this panel, and then it will be open for people to contribute. So the three people joining us today are Catherine Clune-Taylor, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Women's Studies at San Diego State University, where she was hired in feminist science and technology studies. Lauren Guilmette is an assistant professor of philosophy at Elon University. In philosophy, I said that. And Amy Kaler is a professor here in the Department of Sociology at the University of Alberta. And so the comments that I had circulated to the panelists after watching these three amazing videos were organized around the connections and moments of rupture or difference that I saw between the different ideas that were raised. So it seems that pandemic time is a thing. We've all started to experience time differently because of COVID, but what that experience is and who the we is that's having it seems to be very complex and often uneven. So I identified four themes that I think emerge from COVID's time, if we want to call it that. So these are, first, I wonder if time has slowed or speeded up, slowed down or speeded up, and for whom and whether that matters. So in Kato's presentation, she described apocalyptic events as durational and cascading, and Lauren alludes to plural crises. And Amy talks about, in her phenomenology, she talks about time feeling very urgent versus the reality of airport time, I called it, right? So the idea that you have to go to the airport and it's urgent, but actually time has become very stretched. So there's a lot of writing, as I'm sure you all know, in sociology about social acceleration that tries to sort of think this through on a large scale level. And I've seen a lot of people suggest the opposite, that an inadvertent and maybe positive consequence of pandemic time is that things have become more local and more slow. But as I said in my comments to the panel, maybe this is just for the sourdough crowd. There's lots of pushback here from people who are working in healthcare, for example, or who are working in the gig economy, or who are doing political organizing, for whom the pandemic has reorganized time in a much more frenetic way. So I wonder if it matters whether we've speeded up or slowed down, who the we is. Second theme is, how does the loss of physical intersubjectivity for many people, because of digital workplaces and the loss of social events of various kinds, what Lauren calls isolation, how does that shape the experience of political affect? So this isn't strictly about time, but I think it's really closely connected. So we're seeing all of these political movements arise or continue in a new or newly visible form, some of which insist on occupying space. So it's, to me, the moments in which it's necessary to demonstrate in public are really interesting. So Lauren suggested that we have some pandemic feels that have circulated in really diverse and contradictory ways. So how's that related to digital life versus the necessity of being together in space? Third, will the loss of shared routines, which we seem to have been hit with, but also the grind of routine, including sometimes new routines, really create any new spaces for philosophizing or for politics? So does this require a longer shake-up of late capitalist economies than we're likely to get? So, you know, we'd like this to be an opportunity to make things radically different, but it doesn't it seems like we need a bit more than wishing and thinking that that's just going to happen. Are we going to be able to look around for temporal cues? So Amy had raised these fascinating examples of science fiction within which people move in time travel, right? And have to try to work out not just where they are, but when they are. Are we going to be newly able to locate when we are because of this disruption? Or are we just basically disoriented, unmoored? And is there really a we in any of this? And then finally, does the pandemic mark a line between before and after in any important way? So Cato implies in her comments, not really. It exposes inequalities that were there for many people. So the legacy of slavery and indigenous genocide are experiences that extend over hundreds of years. And there's nothing, I think, for many of the people who are involved in indigenous politics and anti-Black racist politics, there's nothing perhaps particularly new about this moment. Lauren at least suggests that our temporal economy has been exposed in some way. And while Amy has lost her temporal proprioception, are there lessons to be learned from that? Or will you just go back to normal? Right? Is it phenomenologically or politically possible to return to the before? And are we really talking in terms of before and after? So those were my 4 themes, and I invite each of the panelists to open the conversation however they would like. So maybe I'll go in the same order, and I'll ask Cato to kick things off.
Oh no, I have to go first. Okay.
I know you hate going first. I forgot that.
I do hate going first, so that's fine. Let's just do it. Let's do it. Yeah, I would love to kind of talk about the last question because, you know, as I said, I think this has been really interesting, right? And because, you know, I don't want to deny, like, a lot of things have changed for us in the pandemic, right? And there are a lot of ways in which our daily experience of time has in fact shifted. But I do think in many ways, part of the rupture that I feel like a lot of people position the pandemic as engendering is a kind of a revelation of one's vulnerability.
Yeah.
Right? Like it's we're all stuck at home because this is the only place that we're safe. Right? And other people now become threats to us in different ways. And you know, and then when we look at the kind of disproportionate way in which people of color are being affected by the pandemic, right? Like, I think that it has been revelatory, not only of one's own vulnerability, but also in certain ways of the structures of society, right? Like, I think that one of the things that happened in the middle of this pandemic was that for a lot of folks, they were suddenly like, oh my God, racism is still a thing. And look, it's so bad, right? And so it feels like a consciousness raising about something that was there all along. It's just, you know, I think a lot of people were suddenly at home and had to watch. And so I am really kind of interested to think about what are the continuities, right? What are the things that are actually continuities that whatever this rupture is, it is actually revealing to us. Mm-hmm. But what really actually interested me about your question is this question of before and after. Mm-hmm. And I don't know that we ever go back to a before. No. I don't think we do, right? I don't think we, you know, I think that the kind of social and political and economic upheaval that has been caused as a result of this, and like, to be clear, I don't think we've seen the worst of it yet. No. Is not something I think we will ever go back from. Like, I think our social worlds are just going to change. But I don't know, I think one of the things that we think that like when we talk about before or trying to go back to before, I think what we're looking for is a sense of security, right? A kind of What we want is like the normal routine that we had before, because that was something we were familiar with and understood and felt like habituated in. But also it's about not having to deal with the fact that, like, while I think of myself as middle class, it turns out I'm 2 months away from losing my house, just like a lot of other people.
Yes, people
right?
who weren't like me. Yeah.
Yeah. Or, you know, back in the before time, I didn't really have to think about the fact that my you know, that there might be real disconnects between my government's rhetoric and its actions, right? Or that it was, you know, okay for me to go along with certain kinds of narratives because I wanted other benefits, or I saw it as having other benefits. And so I don't know that I think there is that before. I don't know that I think we ever go there. And in part because I do think that it is this, we are in this stage of plural crises, right? Like, even if we get past COVID, it's not as though the kind of climate change, apocalyptic conditions that resulted in COVID or helped to produce COVID are gone. And so, you know, I think that's something that we can't ever just deal with, right? Like, I just don't think there's any way we can deal with that. So
thank you.
I think we are maybe always disoriented now.
Yes, thanks. Great. Lauren, where are you? Oh, there you are. Yeah.
Hi. Hi. So I just want to thank you so much, Cressida and David, for organizing this. Really excited to be in this group. Well, I'm ignoring that. Okay, so yeah, I was really interested in the second and third questions that you posed. So it sounds like really nicely, sounds like we're going to engage maybe all the 4 questions. So I was really interested in and was thinking together about the question of how the loss of physical intersubjectivity and the loss of shared routines are both shaping our experiences. And and so, good. Yeah, I'm glad you turned it off. Thank you. Okay. And so I would say I'm really interested in this range of affect. And so this is something that comes up in Cressida Hayes' work. This is also something that comes up in a book I've really been liking lately. It's from 2009. It's Kathleen Woodward's book, Statistical Panic. Both picking up on this continuum of affects, right? This sort of polarity or range, right? Between in the early 20th century, turn of the 20th century, boredom and some kind of, what's the word I want? Not panic, shock. Shock is the word I want, right? And so this continuum between panic and shock in the early 20th century, right? And so, right, both Hayes and Woodward are really interested in how, in the moment we're living in now, it's not so much shock, but this kind of constant shock that we might call something like panic. And so I found it really interesting that, I would say in the time since the pandemic has begun, I would say I've learned a lot about how we used to really take the sort of experiences of multitasking for granted, but I've also been really interested in these new spaces of the we that have emerged. So I would say in teaching on Zoom, I've been really, and I've been really grateful to get to start teaching on Zoom, right? I also want to acknowledge that some folks don't have, are not lucky enough to get to do that. And I've been really lucky to have my institution's support in being able to teach remotely. But one thing that I've been really intrigued by in the space of Zoom is the different kind of we that can emerge, right? Because we're not in the space of the institution, actually. We're in this virtual space that I'm moderating. And so I've found it's been really interesting to think about what it means to mentor students as students are struggling with this moment. There's been a kind of, actually, I would say, a sense of we that is more powerful to me than what I've maybe felt before in the classroom, even though we're not actually, sharing space, picking up on one another's hormones, pheromones, right? These kinds of chemicals that we pick up on when we share space. And so I'm really interested in how it is that affect, right, can move when we're not in the same space. And I think in some ways move in ways that we might not have expected. So for instance, the thing that I'm most excited about, though frankly, I'm pretty distracted by the Zoom chat, I'll just say that. But I've found that the Zoom chat is a really radical mode for me to engage in teaching. It allows two conversations to happen at once. Though unfortunately that requires a community of trust, right? So that's the difficult thing. But, right, so I found that in this new we, right, yeah, that was a troll. In this new we that we're building up together, right? I find that my students will have a whole other conversation that I'm just vaguely keeping track of in the chat. And I'm finding that folks who might never have talked much before are contributing in a totally different way. And so there are things that are happening right now, changes in the experience of space and time and changes in our routines that I'm hoping actually to learn some things from this moment when we get back into the temporality of post-discipline, which I would say absolutely described my life before the pandemic.
Interesting. Thank you. Amy.
Oh, okay. Am I muted? I'm not. Okay. Yeah, I will. Sorry, I was a bit distracted by the troll. And there was also somebody who was sort of half naked and dancing around who's been turfed now. But
I
anyway.
missed it.
So, well, this is recorded, so you can go back. And,
Oh, God.
You know. Yes, time speeding up, time slowing down. Yeah, there's a lot of sociological writing on time. Most of it is on, I don't want to say objective, but external ways of measuring time. So lots about clocks and, you know, the invention of clocks and then the invention of watches. So everybody had their own, thanks, David. I had their own personal clock and Fordism and Taylorism and so forth. Not quite so much on the experience of time, and particularly the experience of either very fast movement, which is be time speeding up, or very slow movement, if you can import a spatial metaphor to talk about a temporal feel, as you know, as Lauren might say. What I'm aware of it has to do with the feelings of urgency and of boredom / leisure at sort of opposite ends of a spectrum. And they both sort of rely on, there's a sort of economic relationship between time and the stuff we have to do. And when we perceive that as scarcity, like I've got all this stuff that I have to do, I have to, you know, take my kid here and feed the cat and get this lecture done and kick the troll out of the meeting and do that and that and that, and I don't have enough time to do it all in. It seems like there's not enough time, and that experience of scarcity of time can be like time speeding up. Right. When there's a different there's a relationship of surplus. You know, I don't have a whole lot to do. Time, there seems to be a lot of it relative to the demands that I'm making on it. Time feels like it's slowed down. My understanding is that experience of time slowing down is found, it exists for people that are highly privileged, like what you might call the sourdough crowd, for whom there's suddenly all this time to do stuff. And for people who are very disempowered and not privileged, who don't have anything to do, the idea of someone who sits around all day is an example of someone for whom there's an abundance of time relative to what they have to do. And they may have so little to do because they've been systemically locked out or excluded from all the other stuff that people do when we're being, with air quotes, productive, and so on and so forth. So the experience of slow time kind of goes to the tails of the distribution. And for those of us more in the middle, I'm going to venture a statement which may or may not be correct. the experience of the pandemic is like, there's so much, you know, and there's not an, I have to, because so many things have been downloaded onto individuals that were previously sort of taken care of by institutions, or where economies of scale were in practice that aren't anymore. There's so many things that I need to do and keep track of, and I am in a time scarce situation. Mm-hmm. So yeah, those are my thoughts on that first question.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for those ideas. They're all really rich, and I can see already lots of connections among them. Anybody want to speak back to any of the other people on the panel? I can always talk, those of you who know me. Now I can always fill in time with, you know, comments, but do you want to speak back to each other or comment on anything else that comes out of the presentations? Was that a yes?
Oh, sure. I just didn't want to.
Yeah.
It's always that thing on Zoom where if you start talking and someone else starts talking, so I do the hesitate thing. All of these are all, by the way, pandemic fields, I think.
Yes, I think
new ways that we're learning to engage with one another. So I really enjoyed both of the other introductory comments, and I really I found so interesting the way that Dr. Clune-Taylor was setting up this apocalyptic sensibility that had derailed right into an apocalypse that nobody particularly expected, and, and thinking about all the ways in which, you know, this is nothing that any of us could have seen coming, certainly, but I thought, I don't know, I thought that the way in which we find ourselves, the way in which these multiple pandemics are colliding, right? I think all of us, right, are having a hard time figuring out how to synthesize these experiences. And I thought, I really appreciated the way that Dr. Clune-Taylor brought those together.
Yeah. I think one of the lessons to take away from watching those videos and the way that this conversation is going is just to sort of see all of these multiple I don't know what to even to say, like sub experiences of time and the way that they're banging up against each other, right? So I was reminded, Amy, in listening to what you said about fast and slow, of Sarah Sharma has this great book called In the Meantime that is a bunch of studies of different people. And of course, she says something like what you said about how this fast-paced productive life is often a sign of privilege, even though it's not represented that way in the sociological literature, or even in sort of the business literature, if there is such a thing. And so the sort of the sense that if you're always busy and you're always on the go and you're always doing things, and she has this great chapter about frequent flyers and people who are very privileged business people who travel a lot, then you feel put upon by this experience of time, but it's enormously privileged, and in certain respects it's of your own making, right? And the examples of people who must be slow that she looks at that would fall at what you described as sort of the bottom end of the curve are people who, like taxi drivers. She has a great chapter on taxi drivers, and one of the classic experiences of being a taxi driver is waiting for people. It's waiting for the next fare, right? Or gassing up or getting a snack, or like, so it's this kind of experience of people getting in the vehicle. Often she has a juxtaposition here, the frequent travelers, and them saying, go, 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 I'm late, I've got to get to the airport, and suddenly being interpolated into somebody else's really rapid experience of time. And then knowing that you're going to have to sit and wait for the next fare for some unknown period of time. And so the experience of waiting, she says, is often a marker of being relatively powerless in a temporal system. And so when I think about about the way that she sets up that book with these different case studies to show how there's no singular experience of time, but how a particular subset of people do experience time, tells you something about the political world that you're in. I think we could take the three talks that you've offered to us, the comments, and sort of put them together and say, what are the interconnections here? Like, for who is this slow? For who is this fast? For who is this about increasing their productivity? For whom is it about having nothing to do? And you know, we could see that in many ways the pandemic, as Cato suggests, has replicated a lot of the existing patterns of that were already there, but it's just given them such dramatic shape that we see them anew, maybe is the way to say it. Yeah, Cato, go for it.
Yeah, I'd like to add on to that, you know, I remember very early on in the pandemic thinking, it's so wild how every day feels like it has both too many and too few hours in it simultaneously.
Yes.
All the time.
So it's intrasubjective as well.
Right? Yeah, it's like it's both too long and too short, and I don't understand what's happening. Yeah, and I think there is something, I think one of the things that we're all dealing with, and part of why it is so disorienting, is that we are finding all of these kind of different registers of time that are in tension, and we kind of get that they're in tension, but they're all still applied in the same way, or we're all interpolated in all of them in the same way. And I was thinking about, even, you know, I'm sure all of us academics can relate to this, that the experience I know for most folks in academia is that work has really kind of multiplied with the move online. And so we're all kind of working more. And there is this weird dual set of expectations where, like, you'll get the emails from the university that are basically kind of talking like it's just business as usual. Like, we're really excited for the new year. We're really excited about all you've done to change your courses. We're ready to do this. But then there's also this other acknowledgement that, like, and also this is super difficult and everyone's just trying to get by.
Yes.
Right? And so, like, in some sense, our norms of, like, we now have two norms of productivity, but it's not clear which, like, they're both there simultaneously, and we're just pulled between them.
Yes.
That we're all working all the time and trying to do all of the same things, but we're all also just barely getting by, but we're also still doing all the same things.
Yeah. Yes.
And,
the gap, in a way, between material conditions and the ideology is widened, right?
Yeah.
To put a sort of Marxian spin on it, that now, and it's more visible, I think, because I've heard people who never would have made fun of a university memo being really really scathing about them in the past couple of months, you know, like people who were much more muted in their institutional criticism, now much more willing to say, you know, the things that are being expected of people are so radically at odds with the language that's told about what it is that we're doing as workers. And of course, to people outside a certain professionalized zone, again, I'm not sure that any of that is news, right? Like, it's fantastic to work for Uber. It's so great, as compared to actually working for Uber. Is not, you know, that gap is utterly visible, I think, to everybody in, for example, the gig economy. But there's a certain veneer of professionalism that is intended, I think, to obscure the gap between the reality of work and the story that's told about that work. And that's scratched off now, that veneer. Yeah.
I've got something to just throw in to pick up on Dr. Clune-Taylor's mention of, or your mention, somebody's mention of intrasubjectivity when it comes to time. And this is, I'm thinking and talking at the same time, which doesn't always work out that well, but let's see. That with the all the tech that we're having to use and record your lectures now and play them later, and you know, we're creating these things that are only going to come into service at some point in the future. We are kind of meeting past versions of ourselves more often through a screen than I ever have before.
Interesting.
Like, I've seen way more than I ever want to see of myself, talking about whatever that I recorded 2 weeks ago, and now I'm just checking to make sure it, you know, makes sense or what have you. So these, I mean, 2 weeks ago was not a long time ago. It's not like my 6-year-old self has suddenly reappeared, which would be really jarring. But I am, because of the nature of the kind of academic work that I do, I'm encountering multiplied sort of temporal versions of myself because the work has changed and everything is remote. I mean, remote describes space. There's, you know, big space between us and our students, but it also describes, like, in time, the time when I'm talking about whatever it is I'm talking about in a lecture is very far away from the time, you know, like 2 in the morning or whatever, that some student is going to be watching it on their phone.
Yeah.
So I'm, yeah, coexisting in different spaces. My other thought, just quickly, with time in a sort of macro sense, is that the future has really shrunk down. I'm reading about, you know, these thoughts about what might Trump do with the election. You know, if he loses, will he leave power? Will he not? Nobody knows. Is there, you know, what kind of crisis is going to, I mean, the crisis is here already. How bad is it going to get? And nobody knows. So the horizon of what is predictable kind of on a world scale seems to have shrunk to about 36 hours from pre-pandemic, when I could have reasonably hazarded a guess as to what things would look like 6 months or so from now. So it feels like the political future has gotten a lot shorter.
Yes. Yes, the shrinking of the future.
Yeah.
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 Mm-hmm. We're at 35 minutes from when we opened, so I'm wondering if there's anybody who would like to ask a question from the audience.